Hey-ya-ho, hey-ya-ha. We call the spirits of the night.
Archaeologists studying one of Göbekli Tepe's ancient stone pillars may have uncovered something completely unexpected. New markings carved into the stone do not resemble the usual animal figures or symbols previously found at the site. According to researchers analyzing the discovery, the patterns appear unusually structured, almost as if they were designed to represent some kind of organized system rather than simple decoration. And that is exactly why the discovery is attracting so much attention. Because Göbekli Tepe was already considered one of the most mysterious archaeological sites on Earth long before these markings were found. The site, located in modern-day Turkey, is estimated to be over 11,000 years old. That makes it thousands of years older than Stonehenge and roughly 7,000 years older than the Egyptian pyramids. At the time Göbekli Tepe was built, humans were still believed to be mostly hunter-gatherers. They were not supposed to be constructing massive stone monuments, yet the site contains enormous T-shaped pillars weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in carefully planned circular structures. Many of the stones are covered with detailed carvings of animals, symbols, and abstract patterns. Even today, moving blocks this large without modern machinery would be extremely difficult. And now, the newly analyzed markings are making the site even harder to explain. Researchers say the strange patterns appear more deliberate and geometric than many earlier carvings found at Göbekli Tepe. Some sections contain repeated linear shapes and organized sequences that stand out from the more familiar animal imagery seen elsewhere at the site. The placement is also unusual. The markings appear carved into a specific area of the stone surface rather than randomly distributed. Preliminary analysis suggests they may have been intentionally positioned to be viewed from a particular angle or under specific lighting conditions. That detail has fueled speculation that the symbols may have had a ceremonial, astronomical, or informational purpose. Some archaeologists believe the markings could represent an early symbolic system, possibly linked to ritual practices or seasonal tracking. Others think they may be connected to observations of the night sky. And this is where the mystery deepens. Göbekli Tepe already contains features that some researchers believe show evidence of advanced planning and alignment. Certain stone circles appear positioned with remarkable precision, and several studies have proposed that parts of the site may correspond to celestial events or star patterns visible thousands of years ago. These theories remain debated, but the new markings are adding even more attention to the possibility that the builders possessed a far more sophisticated understanding of symbolism and organization than previously believed. What makes this especially strange is that Göbekli Tepe does not look like a normal settlement. Archaeologists have found very limited evidence of permanent houses, large-scale farming, or ordinary daily life from the earliest construction period. Instead, the site appears to have functioned mainly as a ceremonial or ritual center. That creates a serious historical problem. Building structures this large would have required coordination between large groups of people, transportation of multi-ton stone blocks, organized labor, and long-term planning. According to older models of human history, societies at that stage were not supposed to operate at this level of complexity. In other words, Göbekli Tepe may suggest that organized civilization started developing earlier than scientists once believed. Some researchers now think sites like this may have actually helped drive the transition toward agriculture and permanent settlements rather than appearing after civilization already existed. The new markings could become an important part of that debate. There are also more speculative theories. Some people online claim the symbols resemble coded systems or forgotten knowledge from a lost civilization. Others suggest the carvings may preserve information about astronomical events or environmental catastrophes observed by ancient humans. scientists remain cautious about those interpretations. Right now, there is no evidence of alien technology or advanced machines connected to the site. Most archaeologists believe the carvings were created entirely by human societies, using symbolic traditions we still do not fully understand. But even the conservative explanations raise difficult questions. How did humans, over 11,000 years ago, organize projects on this scale? Why were these massive stone circles later buried intentionally beneath tons of dirt and debris? And why do new excavations keep revealing details that seem more sophisticated than expected? That intentional burial remains one of the strangest parts of the entire site. At some point, ancient people deliberately covered large sections of Göbekli Tepe, preserving many structures for thousands of years. This does not appear to have been natural collapse. Someone buried it on purpose. Today, only a small portion of Göbekli Tepe has actually been excavated. Most of the site still remains underground, which means archaeologists may have uncovered only a fraction of what is hidden there. And that is why discoveries like these generate so much attention. Because every time researchers uncover another part of Göbekli Tepe, the site becomes harder to fit into the traditional timeline of early human civilization. The newest markings may not completely rewrite history, but they are another reminder that ancient humans were likely far more capable, organized, and mysterious than we once imagined.
Deep in Petra's Red Cliffs, archaeologists found a hidden tomb. Inside, there were 12 skeletons. They remained untouched for over 2,000 years, and that's a really weird thing. Most tombs in Petra have been looted, so what makes this find stand out? Let's figure it out. This is the ancient city of Petra. Its huge sandstone cliffs are hard to forget. No wonder it's one of the new 7 wonders of the world. The buildings here are carved straight into the rock, and it already makes the place look unreal. But Petra has also been a star in the archaeology world for a long time. Once, Petra appeared in the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Some scenes were filmed right in front of the famous building called Al-Kazne, or the Treasury. But recently, something even more exciting happened there in real life. A TV team from the show Expedition Unknown came to Petra to film a new investigation. And while they were there, archaeologists made a huge discovery. They found 12 human skeletons and several ancient objects. All of them were buried under the ground in front of the treasury, hidden there for about 2,000 years. Archaeologists didn't start digging right away. First, they used a special tool called ground-penetrating radar, something like an X-ray for the ground. Instead of guessing where to dig, the machine scans underground and shows shapes that might be tombs or empty spaces. Anyway, when the team looked at the radar data, something interesting showed up. The patterns looked very similar to places in Petra where tombs had already been found before. That was a big clue that something might be hiding underground. After seeing the results, the authorities of Jordan gave permission for the excavation. That's when the team finally started digging under the famous site. And that's how they uncovered the skeletons and ancient artifacts. Interestingly, many tombs in Petra have been found completely empty, because over the centuries, anything valuable was taken by looters, or simply disappeared with time. But this tomb was very different. Inside, the team discovered 12 human skeletons and a few ancient objects. Some of the bones even had mold on them. That happened because Petra is carved into sandstone cliffs. Sandstone is quite porous, which means it can soak up water like a giant sponge. The area sometimes floods, and moisture likely slowly made its way into the tomb. Along with the skeletons, the archaeologists found stuff made of bronze, iron, and ceramic. One object stood out: a ceramic chalice resting in the arms of one of the buried people. It was almost as if the person had been holding it when they were laid to rest. Mysteriously, the cup looked a lot like the Holy Grail from the Indiana Jones movie. The famous building above the tomb, The Al-Kazne stands near the main entrance to the city. It's believed to be at least 2,000 years old. This huge structure is carved directly into the sandstone cliffs. Today, it's one of the most recognizable landmarks in the world. But even though the treasury is so famous, archaeologists still don't fully understand its history. One reason is that many of the nearby tombs didn't contain many artifacts, and without things to study, it becomes much harder to figure out exactly when the building was made or how it was used. That's why the team was so excited. The discovery could help them learn more about the ancient people who lived in Petra and built the city. The location of the tomb might already be an important clue. You see, being buried right in front of the treasury was probably a huge honor. The human remains themselves could also tell an interesting story. The skeletons were still lying in their original positions without being moved around or disturbed by looters. That's why scientists can study them much more carefully to learn things like how old these people were, how they lived, or if they were healthy. We could also learn more about the place those people called home, the ancient city of Petra. It was built more than 2,000 years ago by the Nabateans. Starting around the 4th century BCE, this desert city became the center of their kingdom and an important stop for trade across the Middle East. The location helped a lot. Petra sits in a valley surrounded by mountains, and the main entrance is a long, narrow canyon called the Al-Sik. Because the path is so tight, the city was easy to defend and hard for enemies to attack. Thanks to these factors, the city grew quickly. At its peak, around 30,000 people may have lived there, but the city sits in a dry desert canyon. Natural water is kinda limited there. So how did so many people live in Petra? The answer is clever engineering. The Nabateans built a water system that was incredibly advanced for its time. They didn't rely on one water source. It was a whole network carved directly into the rock. They cut channels, pipes, and storage tanks into the cliffs. This helped them guide water from nearby springs into the city. It was like an ancient plumbing system built entirely out of stone. Even better, the water didn't just flow straight into the city. First, it passed through special settling basins where dirt and sand could sink to the bottom. After that, the water was stored in large reservoirs surrounded by thick stone walls, which helped keep the water cooler in the desert heat. Flash floods were also a big danger in the canyon. When heavy rain fell in the surrounding mountains, water often rushed down the narrow valleys. To deal with that, the Nabateans built dams and channels that redirected the floodwater into storage reservoirs. Another intriguing thing about Petra is the location of its main buildings. In 2013, researchers found that several important monuments lined up with the sun during key moments of the year, like the solstices and equinoxes. Scientists now believe that the buildings may have worked like giant calendars, helping people track the seasons in a desert landscape. Natural signs of time can be hard to notice there. Another Petra mystery is 3 massive stone blocks, the Jinn blocks. They go back to around the 2nd century BCE and are some of the first big tombs built in Petra. 2 of them have burial chambers inside, and the 3rd one even has a grave on top, like a little rooftop coffin. No one really knows exactly why they were built. Most experts say they were tombs, but some think they may have been carved to honor deities or used in rituals. But however great Petra was, things started to change in 106 CE. That's when the powerful Roman Empire took control of the city and made it part of their territory. Trade didn't completely stop, but the city slowly lost some of its importance. Later, a large earthquake in 551 CE caused serious damage to the area. It could have been the final blow for a city that was already in decline. Over time, Petra was eventually abandoned and became known as the Lost City. But there's another nickname people used much more often, the Rose City. The name comes from the color of the cliffs around Petra. The sandstone rocks have a reddish-pink color, especially when the sun is low in the sky. What tourists see today is just a tiny slice of Petra. Some estimates say archaeologists have only dug up about 15% of the city. Visitors go through the narrow Seek, gape at the 130-foot-high treasury, walk along tomb-lined streets, and climb over 800 steps to reach the monastery, Al-Dir. But that's like seeing the tip of an iceberg. The rest is still buried. Petra keeps surprising us. In 2016, researchers used satellite images to spot a huge, previously unknown monument. The platform is massive, about 184 by 161 feet, and has columns along one side. Pottery fragments suggest it's over 2,150 years old. So basically, even after centuries of exploration, Petra is still full of secrets. They're just waiting to be uncovered. We all know how it goes. Homo sapiens are way smarter than Neanderthals. Neanderthals were primitive, and we're much cooler than they were, right? Now, what comes to mind when you hear the word factory? Probably something like this. Lots of Homo sapiens, people, working in different departments, huge production lines, packaging, sorting. You can't fit a Neanderthal into that image, can you? Hey, don't be such an evolutionist. We don't judge people here by the stage of their development, okay? And by the way, Neanderthals had their own impressive factories. No conveyors or industrial robots, but pretty advanced for their time. The production line I'm talking about was located in a place we now call Germany. What's funny is that it's a country that still has plenty of factories and a long tradition of working with machinery, so it feels like a continuation of that tradition. Now, poof, back 125,000 years, to the moment when this very early factory appeared. Around this time, Earth was in an interglacial period, with weather quite similar to today's climate, so conditions may have not been the best, but still fairly comfortable. Neanderthals lived their ordinary lives. They used fire to manage vegetation, gathered plants, and apparently, built plants. Pun intended. So if you thought those hairy guys were savage beasts who spent their time scratching lice off their skin, you may owe an apology to this distinguished gentleman. By the way, this is Carl, and he claims to be the owner of this factory. You seem to have underestimated him, so he's left. But I'll carry on talking about this interglacial breakthrough. Archaeologists have recently shown that Neanderthals intentionally chose a lakeside location to process the bones of at least 172 mammals, including deer, horses, and aurochs, a now extinct species of bovine. The study demonstrates that the inhabitants not only broke open large mammal bones to extract marrow, but also ground the bones into thousands of fragments and heated them in water to extract calorie-rich bone grease. Think of it as a food manufactory making flavorful Campbell's soup ready to hit the shelves at your local supermarket. I know it sounds far-fetched, but what I want to show here is that we now have evidence that even Neanderthals had pretty advanced techniques of food processing. This was intensive, organized, and strategic. Neanderthals were clearly managing resources with precision. Some of them were planning hunts. Others were in charge of transporting carcasses, while another group was busy rendering fat in a task-specific area. They definitely had no nutritionists, but they did understand both the nutritional value of fat and how to access it efficiently. Just one example. Scientists now think that when it came down to caching carcass parts, they would do so across the landscape for later transport to the grease rendering site. You know how all factories are supposed to meet production targets? Same here. Experts believe Neanderthals understood there was a certain fat quota they needed to meet to make the literally bone-crushing process worthwhile. Now, you may say, well, it's just one example. It doesn't mean that Neanderthals were that advanced. True, good catch. However, there are more examples, and here's one of them. Technically speaking, in addition to food-related production lines, these guys may have had a chemical production factory. You see, there is evidence that Neanderthals made stone tools using a multi-ingredient adhesive, which they couldn't buy at Dollar Tree for very obvious reasons. The factory headquarters wasn't in Germany this time though, but in Gibraltar, in Vanguard Cave to be more precise. While studying this area, scientists stumbled upon a small hearth that may have functioned as something close to an ancient adhesive workshop. So chances are that Neanderthals were using fire not just for warmth or cooking, but as a controlled tool for producing useful materials. Now, let's see how this hearth worked. If you've ever cooked sauces, you know how they thicken once the temperature goes up. Neanderthals may have spotted something similar while using fire for its basic function, cooking. They put two and two together, and bam! They started glue, or rather, tar production. The controlled fire helped them regulate heat precisely enough to produce a perfectly sticky texture. That tar could then be used to fasten stone blades or other sharp pieces onto wooden handles, with sinew or plant fibers helping secure the joint. If you wonder what the recipe was, scientists managed to reconstruct it, sort of. Basically, it involved burned rock rose leaves, but there was a secret ingredient for the process to work: guano. Guano is what's left of bat and bird feces once they've decayed. It sounds quite disgusting, but it worked, and that's what matters. Let's check out the structure itself. It's quite small. A round pit roughly 9 inches across and about 3.5 inches deep. Its walls are sharply cut, and 2 narrow trenches extend outward to the north and south. The working idea is that Neanderthals packed the pit with rock rose leaves, then sealed it with damp sand and soil, likely mixed with, you guessed it, guano, to limit oxygen entering the chamber. A small fire, probably fueled by grasses and shrubs, would have burned above the sealed pit. As the plant material heated, it released a thick brown resin. Producing that resin required temperatures in the neighborhood of 300 degrees Fahrenheit or more. However, it took scientists some effort to understand what happened inside the hearth. They had to analyze residues from the walls and floor using several chemical techniques, including mass spectrometry. This technique identifies and counts molecules within a sample. It was necessary to reconstruct the likely production method. Once they ran those smart tests, they moved on to the next step, which involved a tad of elbow grease. They recreated the setup themselves, building experimental hearths that matched the original in size, shape, and materials. In 4 test runs, the recreated hearths successfully produced resin, which supported the proposed explanation. Alright, it feels like those prehistoric production lines prove that Neanderthals were much cooler than we thought. A typical idea is that Neanderthals were just wandering hunters, but they probably were not. And it's not only about their production setups. There may be evidence suggesting they organized coordinated hunts that lured wild horses into traps roughly 200,000 years ago. We go back to Germany once again. At the archaeological site of Sunken, researchers uncovered wooden spears, double-pointed sticks, stone tools, and the butchered remains of more than 50 horses of different ages. After a couple of tests, scientists realized these finds are about 100,000 years younger than earlier estimates. The material was excavated in the 1990s from sediments along what used to be a lakeshore. With the updated dating, scientists think the site reflects a period when Neanderthals were already living across Europe. Zoo archaeologists argue that these hunters could understand horse behavior well enough to organize group hunts, steering entire horse families toward carefully chosen ambush points. Yikes! Chances are that by about 200,000 years ago, Neanderthals were cooperating in increasingly complex ways. Organized hunting, shared planning, and coordinated action may have been part of their social life, and they could have possibly reached levels similar to those seen in early Homo sapiens communities. Earlier estimates placed the Sunken tools and horse remains at roughly 300,000 years old. There were no labels, of course, so scientists had to turn to pollen preserved in the sediment layers, which they used to match local vegetation changes with known global climate cycles. Under that older timeline, the hunters at the site might have been Neanderthal ancestors or another ancient human species known as Homo heidelbergensis. But the new timeline points more directly to Neanderthals themselves. To refine the age of the site, a team of scientists analyzed how amino acids, The chemical components of proteins had gradually changed structure after passing. They examined 4 snail shells, 15 tiny crustaceans, and 8 horse teeth from the same sediment layer that contained the spears. Once they measured these molecular changes and combined the results with pollen records and climate data, the researchers calculated how much time had passed since those organisms died. The results consistently pointed to a younger age, around 200,000 years, placing Neanderthals squarely in the role of the hunters behind the Schöningen horse drives. The Tower of London is the ultimate symbol of royal power. For nearly 1,000 years, it housed kings, queens, and the crown jewels. It served as a fortress, palace, and prison. It is one of the most studied and documented historic sites in the world. Yet, archaeologists uncovered unsettling human remains only 10 feet right under the walkway. Who were these people, and how did they stay hidden for so long? The Tower of London sits on the River Thames, in the heart of London. It's a true medieval castle with thick, well-preserved stone walls, armored gates, and watchtowers like you only see in movies. It was built almost a millennium ago, when William the Conqueror took control of England. He needed a fortress to lock the city down and send the message, "The new king is here, so better behave." The entire castle complex covers 18 acres, which is about the exact size of the White House grounds. It still keeps and displays the crown jewels under guard. The Citadel was also a high-security prison for centuries, holding high-profile prisoners locked away. But it wasn't just a prison for humans. For centuries, the tower was a royal zoo filled with lions, elephants, and leopards. The King of Norway even sent a polar bear, which was allowed to swim in the Thames on a long leash to catch fish. One of the biggest attractions is the White Tower, a massive stone keep. Rising about 90 feet, it had been the tallest building in all of London for hundreds of years. Kings famously whitewashed the stones to make them gleam. It stood out like a blinding beacon above the dark, muddy city. Another must-see spot is the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the tower's historic church. It served as the final resting place for famous prisoners and nobles alike. It was just outside of this very chapel that archaeologists made a chilling discovery. The mystery started in 2019 when a routine check uncovered 2 burials. When archaeologists returned to dig some more in 2025, the situation grew from unexpected to, "Hey, what is going on here?" Over 20 skeletons were packed into the soil, mixed with fragments from older burials, proving this spot had been used and reused many times before. These graves span centuries, from the 1200s to the 1600s. So we're not looking at one tragedy. It seems to be a place that kept getting used again and again throughout medieval London. One situation feels like it's from a horror movie. A cluster of at least 6 people from the 1300s that looks unusually messy compared to the others. The timing lines up with the era of the Black Death in London, so this group could be plague-related. But researchers are careful with conclusions for now. On the other hand, some graves look the opposite of rushed. They look expensive. Several people were buried in coffins. In one case, the wood had rotted away completely, leaving behind a perfect shadow of a coffin stamped into the clay. The report says this coffin shadow likely held a juvenile buried in the 1200s. Then there's the chapel itself that might give us some clues. The current building is basically the newest version on this same spot. It's possible that there were 3 or 4 earlier chapels here, and the dig even exposed lost walls and an old floor surface deep down. But what else can we learn about these people? Here's where science can help. Researchers look at teeth. Your adult teeth form when you're a kid, and they lock in chemical traces from the water you drink and the food you ate. It basically creates a permanent record of where you grew up. So the team analyzed 2 specific skeletons. The first one seemed wealthier. The chemistry suggests they might have grown up in Wales and moved around a few times. They even had traces of a high-sugar diet. That was a huge luxury back then. The second person had a totally different story. Their bones showed signs of chronic stress and a much harder childhood. So these were two people from opposite ends of the social ladder. One rich and the other not so much. But they both ended up near each other to be discovered centuries later. Millions of people visit the Tower of London every year. They take selfies and walk the grounds, totally unaware that they might be standing on top of massive tombs. And that forces you to ask the obvious question. If a place this famous can hide ancient graveyards, what else is out there? Because the tower is definitely not the only landmark keeping secrets. In 2019, the fire at Notre Dame forced a massive rebuild. That construction forced workers to lift parts of the floor and reveal a spooky secret. Several tombs hiding two human-shaped lead sarcophagi, sealed like metal time capsules. And inside, there were details that shouldn't survive. Fabric, hair, and even leaves that were left on the head. This stuff points to an important person. It sounds unbelievable, but they managed to identify the person as Antoine de la Porte, a church official who passed away in 1710. The second coffin became its own mini detective story. Scientists nicknamed the man inside the Horseman because his bones showed signs of riding for years. Some new analysis suggests that he could have been Joachim du Bellay, a well-known poet from the 1500s. So, we have secret graves in London and Paris. That part almost makes sense. These are old, crowded cities where people have lived for centuries. But there's one place on Earth where history wasn't supposed to happen at all. Antarctica. Yes, almost literally the edge of the world with nothing human anywhere nearby for hundreds of miles. And still, in 1985, a Chilean scientist found human remains on an ice-free beach in Livingston Island on a spot now called Yamana Beach. A human skull in Antarctica sounds impossible, but the dates make it worse. When the remains were studied, the person appeared to be a young woman around 21, likely from the southern Chilean channels. She passed away in the early sealing area, roughly 1819 to 1825. That's basically the opening minutes of humans showing up in that region. So why would a young woman end up there? One idea is that she might have come with early sealers, maybe as a guide or part of the crew. The original researcher even suggested she could have been abandoned there for unknown reasons. Plus, the spot where they found her is known to have been visited by early 19th century sealers. The pieces fit together somewhat, but no one can really pin down the story. And it gets even stranger. The first discovery in 1985 was her skull, but later researchers came back to the same area and found more human bones. In 1988 and again in 1993, they recovered two femurs, basically thigh bones, near the original site. The big question is obvious. Were those bones from the same person, or did more than one person pass away here? The plan was to use DNA testing to check if the femurs matched the skull. If these three sites prove anything, it's that new discoveries could be anywhere. But the really exciting part is daydreaming about where we could go next. We are entering a phase where technology could make history feel like time travel. Think about what we can do with the gathered data. We can already pull DNA from a tooth to find out what someone ate or where they grew up. Maybe one day we could take that biological code and use AI to completely recreate a person. Imagine a digital human that looks just like them, with the right eye color, skin texture, and even scars. Then we combine that with the environment. Laser scanning allows us to map every inch of those buried foundations. If you feed that into a physics engine, you can rebuild the walls that fell down 500 years ago. That means in our lifetime, you might not just visit the Tower of London to see it as it is right now. You could strap on a headset and step inside the chapel as it looked in 1348, being face to face with history, just without the bad smells or the risk of catching the plague. They finally did it. After 300 years of searching, archaeologists pinned down the location of the lost land of the White Jaguar, the city of Maya hidden in the wild jungles of Mexico. It all kicked off back in the 1500s with the Lacandon Maya. These guys were some super tough survivors who just didn't quit. When their main capital, Lacamtun, fell to the Spanish in 1586, most people would have called it game over. But not the Lacandon. Nope, they packed up, headed deeper into the rainforest, and built their last stronghold, Sakbalan. It was a hidden fortress of stone temples, twisty jungle trails, and howler monkeys acting like noisy little guards. For over 100 years, the Lacandon managed to keep their traditions alive there, far from European control. Then, in 1695, history came crashing in. A Spanish friar named Diego de Ribas stumbled into Sakbalan. And yeah, that was basically the beginning of the end. Soon after, the Spanish took over. By 1721, the Maya had abandoned Sakbalan. The jungle didn't waste time. It swallowed the place whole, with roots tearing into walls and vines smothering plazas. The city didn't just disappear, it got eaten alive. For the next 300 years, Sakbalan turned into more of a myth than a memory. A name archaeologists and explorers would whisper, secretly hoping to find it one day. Plenty of expeditions tried to track it down, but the rainforest is sneaky. Every path looks identical, maps fall apart in the humidity, and even GPS can't cut through the thick green ceiling. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, except the haystack was alive, covered in thorns, and yeah, crawling with jaguars that would happily make you lunch. So how did the scientists crack the mystery? One word: a letter from the 17th century. The letter by Diego de Ribas described all the routes, rivers, and trails leading to Sakbalan. It showed in every detail the journey of the soldiers who walked 4 days to the Lacandon River after leaving Sakbalan. Then they sailed for 2 days and arrived at the church El Encuentro de Cristo, left their canoes, and continued on foot to Lake Petén Itzá in Guatemala. This was already detailed enough, but the scientists needed to pinpoint the exact location with geographic information systems. They took into account vegetation layers and how much each person was carrying to map an approximate range where Sakbalan should be. They fed this information to GIS and calculated where the city should be. And bingo, it worked. Archaeologists traveled through the jungle and found stone temples rising like broken teeth from the earth. There were also some tools and ceramics, and a Spanish church right in the middle of the ruins. The discovery isn't just about cool ruins, it rewrites history. For decades, people assumed the Lacandon simply scattered after Lacamtun fell, but Sakbalan proves they regrouped, fought, and preserved their culture for over a century more. It's like discovering the final chapter of a book we thought ended too soon. There's also irony here. The Spanish friar who revealed Sakbalan helped doom it. Yet his letter, centuries later, also helped save its memory. Today, the ruins sit inside a biosphere reserve, protected by the same jungle that once hid them. Tourists can't just waltz in. It's raw, tangled, alive. The city breathes again, but on its own terms. Scientists just uncovered another lost city, buried under the thick jungles of Mexico. It had been hiding there for 600 years. The place is called Gengola, and it's massive, about 360 hectares with more than 1,100 buildings, 2.5 miles of defensive walls, its own network of roads, and a super organized city plan. Because it was so deep in the jungle, you'd never realize how huge it really was unless you spent years hiking through it. But modern tech swooped in to save the day, using LiDAR, a kind of laser scanning tool. Researchers flew over the site, and in just 2 hours, they had a full 3D map of the entire city. Gengola was built sometime between 1350 and 1521, back in pre-Columbian times, and it used to be buzzing with life. It was a major hub for the Zapotec people, who had been around in the region since about 600 BCE. Families there lived in homes with big central patios surrounded by rooms, and as they got new members, they just add more rooms and stretch their houses out. They even used the mountains around them as natural walls and channeled mountain water for drainage. A lot of their buildings are still standing, which is wild considering how much time has passed. By the late 1400s, the Zapotec were real powerhouses along the Pacific coast. They even fought off the Aztecs, who were constantly trying to expand. At Gengola, they survived a brutal 7-month siege. But even though hiding in the mountains kept them safe, it wasn't perfect. They didn't have enough fresh water or farmland to feed everyone. Just 12 miles away, the smaller city of Tehuantepec had what they needed. So the Zapotec moved there right before the Spanish arrived in 1521. What the scientists have seen so far is just scratching the surface. That LiDAR scan revealed more than 1,000 buildings, and archaeologists are planning years of research to figure it all out. Instead of digging everything up and risking damage, they'll use advanced scanning tech to keep studying the city safely. Alright, now let's hop across the world to Egypt, where archaeologists stumbled on a whole lost city called Imet, tucked away in the eastern Nile Delta. The place was buried under layers of mud, water, and time, hiding in a swamp that's been shifting and changing for thousands of years. Scientists first noticed it from way up high in faint little clusters of mud brick foundations in satellite images. The shapes looked shaky and ghost-like, but too neat to be natural. So they followed the patterns down on the ground, started digging, and the city started coming back to life. They found multi-story tower houses, basically mini skyscrapers of the ancient world. They had multiple floors, thick foundations, and could handle some serious weight. That kind of vertical living is super rare in Egypt, especially outside the Nile Delta. It showed that people in Imet weren't just spreading across the land, but stacking upward, which means the city was packed, carefully planned, and way more urban than anyone thought for that time. And it wasn't just fancy housing either. Archaeologists also uncovered a grain processing center with paved work areas, animal pens, and organized spaces for food production. Clearly, this was a city with a real economy running behind it. Not far from there, they spotted a ceremonial road that once led to a temple for Wadjet, Imet's patron deity. But later on, other buildings got plunked down over the road, which shows that Wadjet's worship faded over time. Still, the ruins coughed up some amazing relics, a green faience little funerary figurine, and a stela showing Harpocrates perched on crocodiles and gripping snakes. He was the Greek spin on Horus, deity of silence, secrets, and the newborn sun. And there was even a bronze sistrum, an ancient Egyptian musical instrument decorated with twin heads of Hathor. Turns out, Imet was active from around the 4th century BCE onward, stretching from Egypt's late period into the Roman era. Its location along trade routes made it a magnet for merchants and pilgrims visiting Wadjet's temple. So it wasn't just hanging on, it was thriving, connecting, trading, and adapting with the times. And this isn't just another dusty ruin. Imet is giving us a window into everyday life, religion, and urban planning in the Delta, which we've always known way less about compared to the big pyramids and tombs. Archaeologists just found the remains of a lost city from thousands of years ago hiding in southeastern Europe. They were sure that it was nothing more than an old defense outpost, but new digs are changing that big time. They now believe the site might actually be the lost capital of an ancient kingdom of Lynkestis that has to do with Alexander the Great, the man who changed history. The ruins are near a small village called Cernobuki in North Macedonia. You can find mentions of them from 1966, but nobody really dug into them until about 15 years ago. At first, they found just a few ruins and thought it was a guard post used to spot Romans coming from the west. But now, a team of scientists went back with high-tech equipment and found proof this place wasn't just a tiny outpost. Researchers managed to look under the ground and found that the Acropolis the ruins sit on, which is a flat hilltop, has enough rooms and infrastructure to host a full-on city inside the fortress walls. It covers about 2.8 hectares and around 10,000 people lived here at its peak. Researchers also found a textile workshop and plenty of artifacts, including a coin from the time of Alexander the Great and with his image, axes, game pieces, and an oil lamp, and even a small ceramic with a heart motif. One of the coolest finds is a reusable clay theater ticket, which was unique to North Macedonia. This means there was also most likely a theater here, and it could be in one of the large buildings. Experts used to think that the city was from the time of King Philip V, but now, thanks to the coin and especially the ancient tools and broken pottery that were found, they believe people might have lived there during the Bronze Age. Lynkestis and the rest of Upper Macedonia had some pretty intense weather with freezing, rainy winters, and super hot summers. Life there wasn't easy, and most of the time, it was all about surviving. The people who lived in the area were mostly nomadic herders, and they had to move around depending on the season. They traveled with their flocks of cattle, goats, and sheep, always looking for the best pasture lands. Back then, Macedonia was kind of like the outsider of the Greek world. It was part Greek, but powerful city-states like Athens and Sparta didn't really accept it. Thanks to this position on the edge, Macedonia had the chance to mix Greek traditions with local culture. Eventually, they took over and changed the whole ancient world under kings like Philip II and Alexander the Great. The new discoveries at Cernobuki show us how connected and powerful ancient Macedonia really was, especially since the city sat along trade routes to Constantinople. Big historical figures like Octavian and Agrippa might have passed through the area on their way to clash with Cleopatra and Mark Antony. The place could also be the lost capital of the ancient kingdom of Lynkestis or Lyncus. Some experts think that a major city in Upper Macedonia could be where Queen Eurydice was born. That powerful lady gave birth to Philip II of Macedon, who took over Lynkestis in the 4th century BCE. The kingdom of Macedon became independent, and thanks to it, the son of Philip II, Alexander the Great, later became the king of the Macedonian Empire. That man totally lived up to his name. In just 13 years, he created one of the biggest empires in history, stretching from Greece all the way to Egypt and India. And he managed to do all that before passing away at just 32 years old. Researchers plan to dig deeper into this important site to learn more about the early civilizations of Europe. This incredible discovery was possible thanks to LiDAR. This remote sensing tool helps map things like how tall plants are, how thick forests are, and other details across big areas. LiDAR is an active system, meaning it creates its own energy, in this case light, to scan the ground. A laser fires super fast pulses of light that shoot down to the ground and bounce off things like buildings and tree branches. The LiDAR sensor then catches the reflected light and records it. The system measures how long it takes for the light to go from the laser to the ground and back. This is called the two-way travel time. That time helps figure out the distance the light traveled. Then, using that distance, the system can figure out the exact elevation of different spots. Scientists recently found another lost city using the same technology. This one, called Giangola, was hiding beneath the dense jungles of Mexico for 600 years. All this time, researchers believed there was just an abandoned fortress there. There was no way to go and see until recently, when they used LiDAR and got a 3D model of the area in just 2 hours from a plane. Giangola was built in pre-Columbian times between the years 1350 and 1521. It covered 360 hectares and had over 1,100 buildings, 2.5 miles of defensive walls, and a whole network of internal roads. The city had a well-planned urban layout with temples and ball courts and separate neighborhoods for the elites and commoners. It was a crucially important place for the Zapotec people, a group that had lived in the area since around 600 BCE. In Giangola, families lived together in homes with big patios in the middle, surrounded by rooms. As families grew bigger, they would add more rooms and expand their homes. Since Giangola was surrounded by mountains, the locals tried to use every piece of land on the slopes that was good enough to build a house. They even used natural drainage of the area to have water, and they must have been great at construction, as many of their constructions are still standing today. But at some point in the beginning of the 16th century, they didn't have enough fresh water and good farmland to grow food, and moved away to nearby Tehuantepec. Archaeologists plan to learn more about how the Zapotecs were organized, how they ruled their cities, and how they interacted with the Spanish when they arrived. They plan to study all 1,170 buildings found in the LiDAR scan, and it'll take a few years. Another recent find, made with the same groundbreaking tech, is a massive city that lay hidden beneath the thick green canopy of the Amazon rainforest. A whole network of houses, plazas, roads, and canals was hiding in the shadow of a mighty volcano. Many scientists thought that ancient Amazonian people lived in tiny huts and cleared patches of land to survive. But this city, built 2,500 years ago and inhabited for nearly 1,000 years, debunked that theory and changed everything. Now, researchers think tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people lived in complex urban societies. They scanned the area and found that 6,000 rectangular platforms, each about 66 by 33 feet and 6 to 9 feet high. These structures were arranged in clusters around central plazas that had straight roads with perfect right angles and paths connecting them. One of the roads was an impressive 16 miles long. Building straight roads like this is way harder than just going with the landscape. Some of these roads may have had great spiritual or ceremonial significance. The civilization was thriving thanks to rich soil from a nearby volcano. But the same volcano may have also led to its downfall. Researchers also found signs of threats to the cities, such as ditches that blocked entrances to the settlements. Maybe some people living nearby were trying to get in. The next step for the scientists will be to study the adjoining 116 square miles to know more about this large, complex society that could be bigger than the well-known Mayan cities in Mexico and Central America.
Eridu, a megacity older than the first known civilization and older than the pyramids of Giza, was buried in the sands of the Mesopotamian desert for over 2,000 years. Now, scientists have made a discovery that changes what we know about the ancient city. They found over 4,000 canals around Eridu that brought water to more than 700 farms where people worked between the 6th and the early 1st millennium BCE. Now, Eridu was founded around 5400 BCE and was the city of the first kings and history's first city according to the Sumerian king list, an ancient text on a clay tablet. Ancient Sumerians believed that deities created this city when they decided to settle on Earth. Eridu plays such a big role in Sumerian myths and legends that, at some point, people used to think it was just a mythical location. The most famous Eridu myth says that the skies got angry because humans were too noisy, so they decided to send a great flood to wipe them out. A new study showed that the Euphrates River served as the source of water for the entire city. The researchers mapped what remains of the ancient landscape and found a well-developed network of artificial irrigation canals. They discovered 200 large main canals pulling water from the Euphrates, and those canals fed another 4,000 smaller canals. The team used everything from satellite images and drone footage to soil analysis, old records, and remote sizing tech to map out the area. The 700 farms that used the water from the system were different in size, from about 5,000 square feet to over 200,000 square feet. The main canals were a little over a half-mile long, and some stretched more than 5 miles. The smaller canals could be as short as 32 feet. Rivers in Mesopotamia were the main water sources for farming, so ancient farmers had to learn how to guide water from the river to their fields. It all started with simple methods, like digging small canals, but over generations, they learned how to build massive canals up to 62 miles long. The Euphrates itself helped the farmers. Water was moving thanks to gravity down its elevated riverbanks, and natural breaks in the banks let it spill onto the land. Researchers aren't sure when each canal was in use, and it's unlikely that all 4,200 canals were active at the same time during that long period. Now, Eridu used to be an important religious and trade center because of its strategic location on the Persian Gulf. Its economy mostly had to do with fishing, thanks to the Euphrates River. Researchers found fishing nets and weights and whole bales of dried fish at the site. And there were even models of reed boats, the earliest physical evidence we have for constructed boats anywhere. The city was thriving until people abandoned it around the year 600 BCE, and scientists still aren't sure why they did it. The local residents, plus the visiting pilgrims and merchants, had just exhausted all the resources of the land. They had to let it rest several times before abandoning the city for good. It happened when the Euphrates changed its course, and they lost their main source of water. Now, many centuries later, in 1854, a British official was on a mission to this area to check out a remote place that had a bunch of mounds called tells, which are piles of debris left behind by ancient human settlements. At first, Taylor wasn't impressed. He had been hoping to find something big, maybe statues, ancient writing, or ruins of palaces and temples. But with the brief time he had, all he found were things like walls, drains, stone platforms, and pieces of limestone columns decorated with tiny mosaic cones. But he didn't know that these boring mounds were hiding one of the oldest cities on Earth, Eridu. The people at the British Museum got interested in the finding, but the first full-scale excavations took place here only around a century later. The local Iraqi authorities got really interested in the excavations as they were hoping to find more about the earliest days of Mesopotamian history. So they focused on Mound 1, a massive tell as tall as an 8-story building. Soon they uncovered part of an unfinished step pyramid from the end of the 3rd millennium BCE. As they dug deeper, they found layers of human life going back in time. There were levels from the Uruk period, and even remains from a time before the Sumerians called proto-history. In those lower layers, they discovered multiple rebuilds of the Temple of Enki, the city's main deity. People rebuilt this temple again and again for over 2,000 years. Every time the temple collapsed, they built a new one right on top. Each new version of the temple was bigger and more impressive than the last. From the middle of the 4th millennium BCE, these temple buildings became massive, more advanced than anything else humans had built up to that point. The city in Eridu was also becoming more complex, with clear social classes. Eventually, they stopped rebuilding the temple and put up a step pyramid on top of the ruins. Even though Eridu faded, it likely stayed important as a religious site. Archaeologists found pottery from the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE during excavations, although there were no signs of houses. The Sumerians were an innovative civilization, as you can tell. By 1500 BCE, they invented the cedar plow, a tool that let farmers plow and plant seeds at the same time, using animals like oxen to pull it. This gear even came with instructions. The Sumerian Farmer's Almanac gave farmers advice on how to grow more crops with proper tilling and irrigation. These smart farming tricks helped feed more people, which led to larger cities, an organized ruling system, and more focus on religion. And as their cities expanded, so did their work in writing, math, and spiritual life. 5,000 years ago, the Sumerians had already produced cuneiform, one of the first writing systems in history. So another recent find from the same part of the world proves that bureaucracy existed already 4,000 years ago. Archaeologists found ancient administrative tablets in another ancient Sumerian city. These clay tablets are the oldest solid proof we have of the world's first empire, the Akkadian Empire. The tablets were inside a state archive building made of mud bricks, which had different rooms that acted like offices. Now, before this discovery, archaeologists didn't really understand how the first known empire in the world, the Akkadian Empire, worked behind the scenes. But now, thanks to the recent Gerso excavations, we have the first real and unambiguous evidence of the empire's administrative system. They tracked everything – deliveries, spending, and inventory – from fish to sheep to grains, fabric, and even gems. The tablets also include population records, with names and jobs of men, women, and kids, an ancient version of a census. From these records, scientists found out that women played a key role in Akkadian society. Some women had powerful positions, like high priestesses. The tablets also show a wide range of jobs, from skilled workers like stonecutters to people with simpler roles like temple floor sweepers. Some even included building blueprints, field layouts, and canal maps, proving that the empire had serious organization and planning. Eventually, the city rebelled and gained its independence, and the Akkadian Empire's 150-year rule ended. Now, researchers are carefully cleaning and translating the tablets to fully understand what they say. These new finds will replace older, incomplete ideas about the empire and give us a way more accurate picture of how Akkadian power and the ruling system actually worked.
This is a real human brain. Well, it was, until a hot cloud of ash turned it into glass. This crazy transformation happened almost 2,000 years ago, when Mount Vesuvius decided it was a good day to erupt and destroy cities like Pompeii, Atlantis, and Herculaneum. This particular brain belonged to a young man who lived in 79 CE in Herculaneum. Not the most famous Roman town, but it was the first place that was discovered under Vesuvius's ashes way back in 1709. Around 200 years later, archaeologists found the remains of this young man lying face down on a bed. All the smoke and ash probably made him disoriented. So while most of the citizens of Herculaneum rushed to the shore, hoping to be rescued, the brain guy ended up trapped inside a building and passed out. Weirdly enough, this saved his brain from completely disappearing. How in the world does a brain turn into glass? Well, when Mount Vesuvius erupted, it didn't expel just lava. It also sent away a really hot cloud of ash before the solidified lava could flow down. This type of lava, known as pyroclastic flow, could get as hot as 869 degrees Fahrenheit, an insane temperature, we know. Hot enough to melt your brain, but not hot enough to turn it into glass. The cloud of ash, however, can reach temperatures between 932 degrees Fahrenheit to 1,112 degrees Fahrenheit. But to turn something into glass, you don't just need heat, you need rapid cooling too. To put it simply, you have to heat something to a very high temperature until it melts into a liquid. If you let it cool down slowly, the molecules of this liquid will start to calmly organize themselves in the shape of crystals. But if this something cools down super fast, it will solidify in whatever shape the liquid was. It's like making ice cubes. If you pour water into a tray and stick it in the freezer, it will turn into ice because it cools down quickly. But if you leave the water out at room temperature, it'll just evaporate. This means that the brain melted due to a really high temperature, but before it could crystallize, for example, or just boil away, it got really cold. The flow from the eruption was not hot enough for this to happen, but the cloud of ash that reached town before the pyroclastic flow was hot enough to start this process, and fast enough to leave just at the right time. To figure out the exact temperature needed for this brain-to-glass transformation, scientists used a technique called differential scanning calorimetry. This fancy name basically means that they heat up glass shards to see when they start to change shape. They discovered that the cloud of ash had to be exactly 950 degrees Fahrenheit hot for the brain cells to start melting. Now, remember how I said this guy was inside a building, but most of the citizens were outside? Well, those people were also exposed to this drastic change in temperature, but they didn't turn into glass because they were not being protected by the walls of a building. The protection provided by the skull surely helped our guy, but it was not enough. And since other people didn't have the same protection, their brains basically poofed. And before you ask, no other parts of his body turned into glass. You see, you need some liquid for the glass-making process to happen. The brain has a lot of water and fat, which makes it a prime candidate for the glassification process. Yes, I've just made that word up. Other organs might have contained liquid, but they weren't as protected as the brain, so they were destroyed by the heat. And bones? Well, bones don't have enough liquid, so they just remained the same. The ones that didn't char, anyway. When the brain turned into glass, it looked a lot like an obsidian stone, a type of volcanic glass formed by the cool lava of a volcano. Even the forensic archaeologist who discovered this glassified brain thought it was just a stone at first. He was studying the bones of our hero when he noticed something shining inside of his skull, right in the middle of all the volcanic ash that filled it. To his surprise, this thing was way more fragile than obsidian and smaller too, with some fragments being only a few millimeters large. He only figured this was part of that guy's brain after he took the glass to the lab. With the help of a microscope, he discovered that this was not a stone but an organic tissue, which is basically cells that form our organs. This organic tissue was made by protein, a molecule produced by living things like animals and plants. And this was not just any protein. This one was specific to the human brain because every organ is made of different types of protein. The researchers also found nerve cells preserved inside this glass, complete with the tendrils that help them receive and send messages. The microscope also showed what was left of myelin, a fatty substance that gives a speed boost to the messages traveling along the nerves. This isn't the first time scientists discovered preserved human brains. In fact, more than 4,000 brains have been found since the 17th century. It may not look like a big number, but keep in mind that finding only the brain preserved in a skeleton while the other organs are gone is not that common. You see, the human brain is actually the first thing that decomposes when we're 6 feet under, and it usually turns into liquid. When scientists stumble upon a human brain, it's usually dried, frozen, or literally turned into soap. A brain can be dehydrated if a person perishes in a place that is very hot, like a desert. Frozen brains are found, obviously, in places that are super cold, like polar tundras. A brain turned into soap may sound weird, but the saponification process is not that rare. You need a lot of fat and oils to make soap, and the human brain is filled with this. It's a complex process, but if you find a brain that turned into soap, it must have been buried in a place that is very wet and has little oxygen. Back in 1982, for example, construction workers found dozens of human skeletons in a pond in Florida. They were all 8,000 years old, and 91 of them actually had their brains still somewhat intact. And by intact, I mean they turned into jelly soap. During the 2000s, the brains of 45 people were found in Spain, preserved because of this saponification process. This discovery helped researchers understand the chemical composition of the brains and even the weather conditions of the moment when these people passed away. Scientists also discovered two 3,700-year-old brains in Turkey that belonged to a middle-aged man and a teenager that were trying to escape an attack on their city. This time, the brains turned into charcoal because of a super hot fire. And even though their skulls preserved the brains in this state, the heating and cooling process was probably not intense enough to glassify them. But this? It's the first time in history that scientists have found a brain that naturally turned into glass. It's like finding a unicorn but in a more scientific way. So what does this discovery mean? Well, for starters, it gives us a glimpse into the lives of those who existed such a long time ago. Secondly, it taught scientists an amazing way to preserve the human brain. It also shows just how powerful nature can be, powerful enough to turn a brain into glass, but delicate enough to preserve it for thousands of years. So, let's give a shout out to the young man who unknowingly contributed to science. He probably had no idea that his brain would one day be the star of a groundbreaking discovery. His tragic end has given us a fascinating peek into the past.
Okay, what if I tell you that the extraterrestrials we all imagine as little green men may actually look like very normal Earthlings and chill in Europe? This is the Iberian Peninsula, and people living there are under suspicion. Ooh. Here's the reason. Somehow, parts of the most important artifacts that the Iberian civilization called Treasure of Valena are made of metal that simply can't be found on Earth, because it's metal from a meteorite. Now let's tackle this step by step. This is the artifact itself, and it's composed of 59 different objects. Bowls, bottles, and bracelets. Is there a pattern there with all those bees? In total, the find weighs around 20 pounds, of which 18 pounds are 23.5 karat gold. Now, if you're not a metal specialist, I'll clarify it for you right away. For comparison, 23 karat gold is 95.8% pure gold, so 23.5 karat is even purer. The remaining percentage goes to other metals to help add strength and durability to the precious alloy. There was also silver, iron, and amber in that set. The artifact could have been pretty straightforward, but for these two, let's call them imposters. Look at this wrought iron bracelet and this hollow hemisphere. Can you see that? Those rusty lines on the hemisphere and the overall weird color of the bracelet do stand out, since everything else is made of purest gold. This all started back in 1963, when a researcher noticed a dark leaden metal among the shiny bowls and bottles. The metal was shiny in some areas and covered with a ferrous-looking oxide that was mostly cracked. Now, just so you understand, gold does not usually act this way. Gold is one of the least reactive of all metals, so it won't even tarnish, let alone rust. To figure out where this suspicious iron came from, researchers turned to mass spectrometry, which checks out the mass-to-charge ratio of molecules. Their findings showed that the nickel in the iron is similar to that found in meteoritic iron. Simply put, the bracelet and the hemisphere are of extraterrestrial origin. Ooh. Now, the exact age of the trove is hard to determine, yet it's crucial. We need to know the exact age to see if it coincides with the start of the Iron Age in the Iberian Peninsula. If it does, then no further questions here. But if it doesn't, well, it's, at the very least, weird, if not suspicious. So there's this three-age system. It comprises the Stone Age, then the Bronze Age, and then the Iron Age. The Stone Age is of no importance here, so let's compare the Bronze and the Iron Ages. The Bronze Age began when it was realized that combining copper and tin produced a material that was more durable than either metal alone. This era was all about major upgrades in tools and weapons, but two standout inventions were writing systems and the wheel. Then came the Iron Age. This time was all about slowly bringing iron into everyday life. Iron was way easier to shape into cool designs than bronze. Now, this was a big deal because iron, especially transformed into steel, provided significant improvements in all aspects of life. Tools became lighter, cheaper, and stronger compared to their bronze equivalents. You get it? Good. So, researchers have long debated whether the treasure dates back to the post-Archaic era or the latter part of the Bronze Age. The most recent study claims that those artifacts were created in 1400 to 1200 BCE, and something really doesn't add up. First off, the Iron Age began around 500 years after these artifacts were crafted. Plus, ancient craftsmen couldn't know back then how to work with metals that landed on Earth approximately 1 million years ago. And while the dates are really hard to explain, there is a logical explanation for the craftsmanship. The theory here is that those metal workers simply had access to the fallen meteorite, and thus, they could study it well and discover its properties before using it for decorative purposes. They could have figured it out through trial and error, and once they knew exactly how to work with this extraterrestrial metal, they proceeded to adorn the artifacts with it. Plus, there were the Phoenicians, who contributed to their craftsmanship. Now, it's true that the Iberian people have been processing metal and making pottery long before the Phoenicians settled on the peninsula. But the arrival of new metalworking techniques and the introduction of the potter's wheel enabled them to produce better quality goods much faster than before. So, we figured out the extraterrestrial origins of the Iberian artifacts. But guess what? This area is still under suspicion. The reason for that is the language they spoke. You see, for most modern languages people use today, there will always be some proto-language. Say for Italian, Spanish, and French, it's Latin, hence their similarities. But wait, Iberian was largely spoken where modern Spain is, so why isn't Spanish similar to it? Well, the truth is, no language today is similar to the Iberian. Maybe only the Basque language, but it's because of some similarities found in their numerical systems. Basque is classified as a language isolate, or simply unrelated to any other known languages, and the only language isolate in Europe. The Iberian language is unclassified. While the scripts written in it have been deciphered to various extents, the language itself remains largely unknown. And look at the alphabet the Iberians had. Looks like it doesn't really belong to our planet. But hold up, this one might be a bit of a stretch. When the Phoenicians came to the peninsula, they brought along their alphabet to the Iberians. But honestly, the Iberians probably weren't keen on just copying someone else's writing system, so they tweaked it until it looked completely different. Let's just say they took some inspiration and ran with it. While linguists can guess to some extent how most characters sounded, actually translating the language is still completely impossible. The Iberian language was non-Indo-European and faded away over 2,000 years ago. And there aren't any similar languages left to help us out. Super frustrating, right? Yeah. We got over 2,000 Iberian inscriptions from tombs, coins, potteries, lead plates, and even cave wall carvings. But aside from a handful of words, we're totally in the dark about what they mean. Now, if we could understand their language, we might have learned that they were great thinkers and all, but we can only contemplate the works of art they left. Iberian culture has a lot of amazing stuff made by talented artisans. We're talking about not just metalwork and ceramics, but also detailed sculptures, textiles, jewelry, and other personal bling. But here's the catch. Making all those luxury items depended a lot on a big farming class. At the heart of Iberian society, most folks were involved in farming and taking care of livestock. Depending on where you were, the types of farming varied. For example, up in the north, they were all about growing grains, while down in Valencia, they focused on producing olive oil and other agricultural aspects. In the west, raising animals was the name of the game. Still, we don't have much information about the day-to-day lives of the many people doing this essential work. Yet, on the flip side, we know a lot about the upper class of Iberian society, who control these agricultural resources and hire the artisans. By the 7th century BCE, we start to see a group of Iberian princes who were living the good life, trading with the Phoenicians and enjoying fancy luxury items. You can spot this elite class in their burial practices. Cremation was the go-to method for funerals among the Iberians, and wealthy individuals were often found in cemeteries with all sorts of lavish goods and funerary sculptures that give us a peek into the fashion and hairstyles of the rich. Interestingly, starting in the 6th century BCE, there was a noticeable drop in the number of recognizable burials. which suggests that these elaborate funeral customs became more exclusive to a small elite. Meanwhile, the fate of the majority, farmers, artisans, soldiers, and laborers, who made up a big chunk of the population, remains a bit of a mystery. It used to be a pretty advanced civilization, but it vanished without a trace. Researchers think it could have been due to some massive earthquake, but so far, we don't know for sure.
A Portuguese archaeologist just discovered a bunch of sunken ships filled with gold, including a Spanish galleon with 22 tons of gold and silver. This much gold today is worth about $2 billion, and this is the money from one ship alone. Archaeologist Alexandre Monteiro made this discovery almost by accident. He was studying some documents when he found some information about a ship that went missing in 1615, and he decided he wanted to find it. After many years, Alexandre found not just this specific ship, he actually discovered 8,620 shipwrecks in the waters of Portugal alone. Out of this number, 250 are gold-filled shipwrecks, a discovery that would make any Jack Sparrow shake in his boots. Most of these ships went down for boring reasons like the weather, but sometimes they were destroyed in battles, which may or may not have been super epic. They were carrying gold and other treasures from the New World to Europe, and of course, everyone wanted a share. Alexandre had been studying historical shipwrecks for 30 years now, so he has discovered many ships that went down in somewhat glorious ways. In 1816, for example, a ship of one of the richest men in Portugal sank in Australia, with an insane amount of 66,000 silver coins. This was the first ship from Portugal to ever plunge in the waters of Australia. The bad news is that these ancient sunken vessels, filled with riches and epic stories, are not so easy to reach. They're deep down in the ocean and covered by sand. You could still try, but that would be stealing part of a country's history, and you wouldn't want to be that person, would you? Naturally, Portugal was not the only country that explored the seas back then. The coast of Europe is packed with sunken ships filled with gold. In fact, there are about 1 million historical shipwrecks underwater right now, and the treasures abandoned under the sea might be worth around $60 billion. It's an insane amount of money, but let me tell you that these gold-filled sunken ships aren't really worth the hassle. There are many stories of maritime treasure discoveries that turned into insane lawsuits and even long jail time. Our first story starts in 1746, when a violent storm crashed a ship called Prince de Conti near an island in Brittany. The ship was filled with tea, ceramics, and 100 gold ingots. Of course, the owners of the ship tried to save the loot, but if it's not easy now, imagine how it was back in the 18th century. It took more than 200 years for the vessel to be found. It finally happened in 1975, when a group of French men discovered it and decided to take pretty much every valuable thing they could find. Now, I said these things were not worth the trouble for a reason. In France, if you find anything that can be historical, you must declare it to the local authorities within 48 hours. Fail to comply, and you will be committing something known as a crime. To be fair, our French friends here did declare their findings, but only the corroded cannons from the ship. And the gold? Well, they sold it. Obviously, because each gold bar is worth between $125,000 to $231,000. It took French authorities almost 50 years to retrieve the stolen gold, and they didn't retrieve all of it. Part of it was bought by an elderly couple living in Florida, and the crime is so serious they were charged for connection with money laundering, organized crime, and the trafficking of cultural goods. The poachers also sold some gold ingots to the British Museum collection. Now, let's go back to the 1850s, when a steamer called SS Central America traveled from Panama to California and back again. This was during the California Gold Rush, a time when 300,000 people moved to California to dig for gold. Because the travel route was not easy breezy, people needed to carry their gold around on big ships. This is where our friend SS Central America comes in. In 1857, the ship had 578 people on board and about 10 tons of gold. Very few survived, and around $100 to $150 million in gold went down with the ship. All of this explains why in 1988, a group of investors from Columbus decided to finance a research project to find this ship. The research was led by a guy named Tommy Thompson. Tommy was really crazy about the idea of finding this sunken ship filled with gold. It took him years to find the exact location of the SS Central America, especially because the ship was 7,500 feet beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, and retrieving it required a lot of fancy tech. A group of 161 investors paid for his adventure, but it goes without saying that they were not doing this out of love from their hearts. They invested $12.5 million in this project because they were expecting to earn at least 10 times more. But since life is not all sunshine and rainbows, 39 insurance companies sued the research team as soon as they retrieved the gold. Back when the ship was up and running, these companies insured the cargo of the SS Central America, and when the cargo was finally retrieved, more than 100 years later, they wanted to be compensated. They said it was not their job to retrieve it, but that doesn't mean they abandoned it. This crazy talk didn't stick, and 92% of the gold was given to the research team. The plot thickened when the investors were scammed by none other than Tommy Thompson, who fled with $4.16 million. He also had 500 gold coins, but he's not telling a soul where they are. Nonsense like this is the reason why most countries have rules to protect cultural properties. And yes, sometimes shipwrecks can be a cultural property. Obviously, there are many maritime treasure discoveries that happen without breaking any laws. The SS City of Cairo, for example, was a steamship that submerged in 1929 with 2,000 boxes of silver coins weighing 122 tons. A company called Deep Ocean Search retrieved the coins from a depth of 17,000 feet, which is 4,500 feet lower than the Titanic. 34 million pounds went to the UK Treasury, and the Deep Ocean Search also got a share. The good news here is that some of the coins can be bought by collectors, legally. Paying for a treasure is probably the closest you can get to an underwater archaeology find. I know, all I did was destroy your piracy dreams. But while raiding gold-filled shipwrecks may be a crime in most countries, or just financially impossible for us mere mortals, not all hope is lost. There is about $771 trillion worth of gold lying on the ocean floor, and it doesn't have an owner. It's like an underwater gold mine, except the gold is in the water. You know how the water of the ocean is salty? Well, the gold gets mixed with the minerals in the water, so it's not like you stumble upon a gold nugget on the beach. Each liter of ocean water has 13 billionths of a gram of gold, and it's very difficult to extract such tiny particles of gold from the water. But that doesn't mean people haven't tried, and of course, there's been a scam here too. In the 1890s, a guy claimed he had invented a thing that would suck gold from the seawater. When he got enough money, he fled the country with the cash. If you really want to get some gold, you could try to extract it from the Earth's core, which has 1.6 quadrillion tons of gold. There's 16 times more gold in the Earth's core than what humans have mined in the whole of history. No hoax involved here, because nobody has dared to go down there yet. With archaeologists discovering gold-filled sunken ships out and about, maybe we can make our own maritime treasure discoveries, or at least save enough money to buy some silver coins.